The following talk, entitled The Concepts of Buddhism by Lama Govinda, is presented by the Theosophical Society in America.
Namo Buddhaya. Namaste. Now we shall continue our discussion, and there's many questions if you can I think of, I'm very glad to answer. And before I may say a few words in continuation of what I said this morning, I found that, for instance, the philosophy of Shankaracharya comes in many respects very near to that of Buddhism, because also he declares the shunyata, or the ultimate void, you may call, is the cause, or is the beginning of all things. And because unless your things are potentially in the void, they cannot develop into form. So this idea he got from Nagarjuna, who lived in the 2nd century of this era. But in the 9th century, when Shankaracharya lived, he took up the idea of this philosophy actually in order to combat the Buddhist idea, though he took the very weapons which he used from the Buddhist philosophers. But there is one small difference which has escaped most scholars, and that is the difference between Advaita and Advaya. You see, they are very similar terms, but they mean something quite different. Advaita means the one without a second. That means all what we see, hear, feel, and so on, it is all plain illusion in the sense that it is a secondary reality, while Advaya means the polarity which has both different compensating poles, but which belong together. That means you cannot say that the plus and the minus are opposites. You can say they compensate each other, like man and wife. But this idea is fundamental, because as long as we conceive the universe as a duality, that means that only the abstraction of the one is everything, and all the rest, the diversity, for instance, is only secondary and not important. So because according to this idea, Shankaracharya devalued everything that we experience. That means he said that unless you forget the whole world and everything and every impression, unless you dissolve everything and come to the ultimate unity, you do not come to reality. He did not understand that actually what we call our reality is based on certain universal laws. That means if we all look at things, we recognize things. We quite agree that a tree is a tree, or a stone is a stone, or that water is water. But we do not think that these are entities which are entirely different from the rest of the universe. They appear through certain causes, and they react upon us according to our senses. So therefore we have to evaluate them as expressions of reality. What this ultimate reality is, we never can say, because in the moment where we experience, we wouldn't be there. It is like saying that in empty space, if there are no objects in space, you are not even conscious of the term space, because there's nothing. But as long as there is a contrast between space and objects, you can relatively distinguish them, but the one is dependent on the other. You can't have objects without space, nor can you have space without objects. And that makes the vast difference between Advaya and Advaita. And therefore, the modern scientific view is much nearer to the Buddhist view of Advaya, because we do not evaluate things. We do not say this is good and other is bad. We do not see only unity is good and every diversity is bad. On the contrary, I would say diversity is the only spice of life. If there is no diversity, then life is completely uniform and completely meaningless. So all our values, all our ideas, everything depends on this distinguishing faculty. And this distinguishing faculty is our consciousness. So therefore, consciousness is, so to say, the last instance, the last value of which we can speak. We cannot say, well, I want to merge with the universe. Well, if we have not a consciousness which distinguishes ourselves from the things around us, then we cannot experience even the universe. Because it is as another point, we can very well understand our inner unity, our relationship to things. We can see that the whole world is an infinite relationship, that everything depends on the other. So if we speak of dependence, we should understand that it is only if we understand the universal dependence, then it becomes meaningful. But if we are only dependent on this or that thing, then we limit ourselves. So perhaps you remember that Krishnamurti once said that we have to overcome our conditioning. Well, I would say be universally conditioned, because if you are conscious of your complete conditioning, then you are free from conditioning. But if you are conditioned only by your present circumstances, by your present style of life, or your senses, or whatever it may be, then then you are conditioned in a limited sense, and you cannot understand the other things. So we have to understand the world as a great system of interrelationship. And I think the idea that people, for instance, even what we regard unimportant events, no event in the world is as unimportant as not to influence its surroundings. That means we must have a much wider perspective. We must not see ourselves as units separate from our surroundings, but we must understand that our surroundings and we ourselves form a greater unit of two polarities. And this makes really sense of our life, because then we can feel with other things, we can, so to say, widen our consciousness in such a way that we do not only see a tree or any object, but we can feel more or less identical with the object in a certain sense. So this is a real point of meditation, that we do not want to remove any object, but we want to become one with them, one with it, because we want to experience, so to see each object from within, not only as something which stands against us. So therefore, in meditation, we try to overcome the subject-object relationship to a certain extent, insofar as we exchange our standpoint between this and that we understand the unity of subject and object, which is actually the condition or the condition for our relationship. We wouldn't be able to understand, to say, well, this is a tree, if we are not able to experience within us this treeness, so to say. So this, I wanted to say in addition to this morning, because I said that we have very similar words which we use in Sanskrit, which are used by the Vedantist, by the Vedist, by the Vedantist, by the Buddhist. But we must not be deceived to think that the identity of an expression means even the identity of meaning. So, for instance, if you read let me say, the Sanskrit of Sankaracharya, and you read the Sanskrit of the Vedas, you will find that the same term is used in quite a different sense. And the famous commentaries by Sankaracharya, which are very interesting, and some of them maybe also very acceptable, I would say. He was a great scholar, no doubt. But what he tried to do was to interpret the Upanishads or the Vedas in the light of Vedanta, which gives a different meaning. It is very beautiful, but it is not the meaning which was originally meant. So we have to be very careful. And on the other hand, I will give you another example. You all may know the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the most beautiful religious poems of India. Now the Bhagavad Gita is like a layer cake. There are so many different layers that you can practically support any particular opinion by the Upanishads, by the Bhagavad Gita. So for instance, in the beginning, you have the pure Sankhya. Well, if you don't understand Sankhya, you cannot read a theistic text into the Sankhya. The second part is Vedanta. It will finally come to the Bhakti movement, and all these different layers are historically coming one after the other. So therefore, we have to be very careful in quoting the Bhagavad Gita. We have to know exactly to what it refers. We cannot simply pick out certain things and use it as a support for our opinion, but we have to understand that these are the different layers of the different views which were developed in India long after the Buddha, and probably they began in a time when Sankhya still had a greater influence in Buddhism, in Hinduism, and in the general outlook in India. Now Sankhya is unfortunately one of those philosophies which are least known even in India. You will be astonished to read, for instance, great scholars like our last Prime Minister, really great scholars have quite naively taken this as an idea that everything developed from the Vedas. They don't distinguish at all between the different historical periods, and because they themselves are mostly Vedantins who see everything in the light of the Vedanta, and by that they cannot distinguish all these finer shades in philosophy, and it is exactly those finer shades on which the whole philosophy depends. So, as a typical example, when we speak about Shakti, which is a very convenient term, in India you would call Shakti any deity, any female deity. But if you have a female deity in Tibet, then it is not a Shakti, as most manuals will tell you, but there is a prajna, that means an emanation of wisdom. So we have to be very careful in our definition, and we cannot simply take over from one term to the other system. So if we know that, then only we can really understand the great manifoldness of philosophy in India. And I would say it is really the beauty of Indian religions that they have such different facets, that you can see the same thing from different angles. And most of these things have developed according to the experience. And if you nowadays, for instance, you may say, if you want one thing which characterizes practically all Indian religions, then you can say it is ahimsa on one side, as Gandhi propagated, ahimsa, and karma. Now, as I said before, karma can be defined in different ways, and ahimsa is a thing which can only have come in existence after the period of the great sacrifices and so on had gone. So we have to be very clear about these different distinctions. And now the question is, how came the idea of ahimsa into the different Hindu religions? And here I can say that what we nowadays call Hinduism is actually after development of the Vedic religion under the influence of Buddhism. Buddhism was more than 1 millennium, in fact 1.5 millennium, the greatest religion in India, and it influenced all the different sections of India, and so we have really what we see now, a mixture or amalgamation of Hinduism and Buddhism. So in this way it came into the general view. Now please, I should be very glad to hear your questions, which will, please.
Could you differentiate some of the main differences between Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes, Zen Buddhism is actually one facet of Buddhism in general, because Zen is another word for dhyana, and dhyana means insight. Now, it is quite true that Buddhism is mainly based on insight, mainly based on yoga or meditation. And the Zen Buddhists, in their time, they found that the scriptures had become so manifold, so many different views in scriptures and things, that they wanted to go to the very core of Buddhism again. And they said, there's only one thing in this life, and that is your inner vision. And so they developed several techniques of meditation and created this form of Buddhism. But naturally, even if we want to practice meditation, it is quite true, we have to re-experience Buddhism. We cannot only read about Buddhism and know about it, but we have to experience it. And the experience is more important than what we read. But on the other hand, it needs a certain background, a certain knowledge of the general development of Buddhism, the texts and so on, in order to understand koans. Koan is a short sentence, generally very difficult to understand. It is a short aphorism, I would call it, which is based on the former scriptures. Now, if you don't know those scriptures, then it makes no sense. It has no connection. You can, nowadays you get koans which seem to be so abstruse that you will say, well, there's no meaning in it. But if you would know that all these koans were created from certain parts of the scriptures and had a certain connection and a background, then you will know that they were not meaningless. They may not be explained in simple words, but there is a meaning behind them. I would say the meaning, if you hear a piece of music, if you hear a sonata or another composition or so, that is meaningful, though you cannot express that meaning in words. So it means that you have a koan, you have a meaning, even if you cannot express it in words. So this development created the two main branches of Zen Buddhism. And the one which is based mainly on those koans, and the other which leaves it to the meditating subject to find his own way. Well, that's all very good, but many people lose their way while trying to find it. That means they go into meditation hoping enormous, wonderful results. And if they don't get them in time, they begin to despair. But in Tibet, they have quite a different method. In Tibet, first of all, the guru instructs the pupil in every detail and explains the whole world view. And in the end, when he really understands what it's all about, then he gives him one, so to say, one mantric word, which condenses the whole thing into one short sentence. And then the pupil knows exactly what it means, and at the same time, he establishes a relationship to his guru, like a father to his son or his daughter. And this relationship is so profound that he will, during his whole life, never be alone. And what is the most important part? The guru imparts during the initiation ceremony his, so to say, his own consciousness to the pupil. That means he allows the pupil to partake of the advanced consciousness of the guru, though even if the pupil has not yet reached that point, but now he knows what he wants to attain. He doesn't go blindly about hoping to come to some result, but he has got a foretaste of what he will achieve, and that it can be achieved. And this is the great assurance which is given in Tibetan Buddhism, and which I am afraid in Zen Buddhism is never being given. On the contrary, because the Roshi will either discourage him from, will criticize him each time, and only people who can go through that dark night of error and doubt will finally come through. But it is a very steep way, and very few people will reach that success. And they have no assurance that they can reach that aim because they have never seen it. While in Tibetan Buddhism, the aim is so clearly before the eyes of the acolyte that he knows exactly where he goes and what he wants to attain.
Does the soul dev help a lot in your keeping with communication with your guru, so that you know the consciousness? I don't know that I'm pronouncing it correctly. The soul dev, you know what I mean?
What is it?
The first part of the sentence wasn't clear.
The word soul dev.
Soul dev, oh, soul dev.
Oh, soul dev, yes. Uh-huh. Well, soul dev is a formula of praise. A soul dev, you see, a guru generally gives a pupil a soul dev. That means a short kind of poetic composition which you can repeat and which you can connect with your guru, and which is in a certain way a beginning of your inner concentration. That means you create a precondition for that. But the soul dev is not the important thing. Much more important is, let me say, the mantra which he gives you, and the deity to which he connects you in that mantra. Because each mantra has as I said, it is not translatable, but it has certainly a meaning. And this meaning is the whole background of it. You have a certain color, a certain sound, a certain form, a certain deity, a certain type of consciousness, and so on. All these things must go together with a certain mudra, a certain gesture, and whatnot. It must be a complete unity. And actually, a mantra cannot be really understood unless you practice it all your lifetime. So it is the essence of all that he has taught you. For instance, if you read the Prajna Paramita, which is a great work of Nagarjuna of the 2nd century BC, not BC, of 2nd century AD. There's a very beautiful sermon on the transcendental wisdom. And this sermon has in the end a short mantric formula. Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasangati Bodhi Swaha. Now, if you try to translate it, you could translate it perhaps, but really it is the summary of the whole chapter. And this chapter of the Prajna Paramita has been extended into 10,000 slokas, a huge volume. Now these 10,000 slokas can be expressed in one short formula, but provided you have read and understood the whole treatise, the formula means nothing, because it is only stated gone, gone, gone beyond, gone to the other side. Now what is the other side? You must know that the other side means in that phase the final nirvana or the complete freedom. So I mean there are many things which have a very particular meaning and which require the general background and the knowledge of the scriptures. That means you should not stunt your imagination or your intuition, but you should take the reasonable approach towards your intuition. You cannot start on the intuition and then afterwards find a reasonable ground for it. But it is the opposite way. First you have to establish your intellect before you can leave it, and you can go into the realm of intuition. So these are some of the principles of Buddhism. Yes?
Yeah, to a great degree, the Theosophical Society is dependent upon a particular branch of Tibetan Buddhism, because the Book of Kyuti was founded in the Chigasi Library of the Panchen Lama. I would just like to know what particular branch of Tibetan Buddhism that you studied under when you were in Tibet and you had to compare to the Tsongkhapa influence of the Golab.
Well, we were fortunate enough to have 4 gurus. That means one was Gelugpa, one was Nyingmapa, one was Kagyutpa, and one was from the the Sakyapa, yes. Well, these are 4 branches of the Buddhist schools of Tibet. But really, they are not contradicting each other, because the one is interested in the, I would say, in the book knowledge. The other is interested in intuition. The third is interested in meditation. The fourth is interested in history. That means these different aspects do not contradict each other, but they compensate each other. So we were lucky enough to study under 4 great masters of Tibet and really got a survey of the whole of the Tibetan Buddhism without being sectarians. Because if you take one school alone, you become little one-sided. It may be a very good side, but still it's one-sided.
Why do the Red Hats have a bad reputation?
They haven't got a bad reputation. The bad reputation of the Red Hats was created in Europe and not in Tibet, because the people knew only about the Dalai Lama and about the Gelugpa sect. Now the Gelugpas are very good, very learned people, but the other people, I would say, who succeeded in the intellectual aspect, which naturally for Western people is the easiest to understand. While, for instance, the Nyingmapa are more, I would say, more intuitive, and perhaps they have got things which do not coincide with our intellectual viewpoint of the world. So, but nowadays I think we begin to understand that all these different forms of Buddhism were really helping each other, and that there is none of those big schools which can say that they have the whole essence of Buddhism alone, but they have developed the different sides of it. So now the red sects, you speak about the red hats. As you know, we are belonging also to the red hats partly, but we accept also our Gelugpa lamas. That means all the sects of Tibet except one belong to the red hats. That means you cannot throw away the whole of Buddhism of Tibet and only keep one school. If you want to know what is Buddhism, you have to take the whole thing together in all its different aspects. And it is only unfortunate that up to now, only the Gelugpas were known and recognized by European scholars because they found it perhaps more appealing to their intellectual point of view. But the mystic side of Buddhism is mainly enshrined in the so-called red sects. And you may know perhaps that Karmapa, who came here to America, I think last year or so, who had a very great impact upon the people, and he is also one of the schools which we are classified under red hats. The difference between the red hats and the yellow sect is really this, that the red hats represent the older schools of Buddhism, and the yellow sects are a kind of reformation, or they tried to bring about a reformation, which does not necessarily mean an improvement, but only that they laid particular stress on discipline. That is in itself was very good and probably also necessary for some reason. But it developed into a political power system. And the power system which it developed in Tibet grew to such an extent that the other sects were simply more or less suppressed, or they were recognized from the religious point of view. But the government lay in the hands of the Gelugpas. And since they formed the head of the government, they had all the government support for their monasteries, while the other sects had to fend for themselves. So one has to see it also in that political view. But nevertheless, yes.
What is the correct pronunciation of the concept Sunyata?
Shunyata. Shunyata. Shunyata.
And would you say something about it, please?
Yeah, Shunyata is perhaps one of the most important concepts of Buddhism. And Shunyata some people try to make out that shunyata means nothingness. But really speaking, that is a very one-sided view. Shunyata means perhaps we can translate it as emptiness. But now the question arises, emptiness of what? There can't be emptiness in itself. There must be emptiness of something, isn't it? If you speak of emptiness, if you speak of an empty room, it means a room without furniture. Or if you speak of an empty mind, you mean a mind without concepts. If you speak of an empty bottle, it means it doesn't contain any liquid or any water or so. So each time we speak of emptiness, we have to remember that we always speak of a relationship to something. And that is the very point. If you call shunyata emptiness, it means emptiness, empty of material objects. But these material objects do not exist in themselves, but these material objects are condensation of the great interspace. If you speak of the universe, then you can easily find out that in the whole of the universe there's an enormous space and very little substance. In fact, matter is so rare in the universe that I would say matter is the highest condensation of universal forces that we know. And we have made a great mistake in thinking that matter is something despicable, something unimportant, and that we want to get rid of it. If we really would understand that matter is a concentration of energies, then we would suddenly see that matter is not actually different from what we call space. That space is only the invisible matter. Or, in other words, if space becomes visible, it creates certain forms. And these forms can never exist in themselves. You cannot imagine any form which does not occupy space. You always think at the same time, even if you are not conscious of it, you always think every object with its space, but never without it. So therefore the term shunyata is hinting at the precondition of all things, of everything which we can imagine even. So it is that fertile ground of which everything appears. It is that concentrate, or that I would say, which is incommensurable for our mind, but which is nevertheless not nothingness. There is nothing like this. So shunyata shows the relationship of all the different things in the world and their interdependence. And therefore shunyata is the central idea, the central concept of Buddhism in general. Yes?
What is the meaning of the term, the title Lama?
Pardon?
What is the meaning of the title Lama?
Title Lama. What's the meaning of the title Lama?
Oh, yeah. Well, the title Lama actually means this superior. And Lama is a word which in Sanskrit could be translated as Acharya. Acharya means teacher. And Acharya can be anybody who can teach or who knows the dharma, and that means a religious teacher. And so Lama has nothing to do, for instance, in many European languages, Lama is an equivalent for a monk, but that's wrong. Because a Lama can be a monk and can be not a monk. It makes no difference. It depends on the knowledge, not upon the state in life, whether you are married or not. So the same way, if we speak of lamaseries or monasteries or all this. You see, the term monastery is really a misnomer, because a monastery should be only a place in which monks live. But in Tibet there are innumerable monasteries for all sorts of people who follow the religious life while being married. Just as the Brahmins of old were married people, but those who had studied the dharma, who were teachers of the dharma, who were religious leaders. Yes?
Yeah, in the Prajna Paramita Sutras, in the beginning of the translation, there's a portion where it says there are no dharmas.
There are no what?
There are no dharmas.
Well,
How does it fit in with that?
you see, yes, dharma, has got, first of all, dharma has got many meanings. The word dharma means actually support. Dharma is support. Now you can speak of the dharma in the sense of a religion. That means that is the religious law as it is used among men. But you can speak also of dharma as the universal law. Now this universal law has to be transformed into our personal law, into the moral law of humanity. So that there already you have two different meanings. The one comprises the aspect of any particular religion, and the other refers to the world law as such. So dharma also has got a third meaning rather. Namely, dharma means other things. You speak of dharma as dharmas, that means things, that means objects. And so you have a dharma theory in Buddhism, which says all these different elements, they appear momentary, but they will always reappear again and again. You can speak always of iron as iron, and of wood as wood, of water as water. But there is no substance which is called water or wood or anything else. But it is some combination which appears momentary, disappears again, and under the same conditions will reappear. That means there is nothing which is static. Everything is dynamic. Everything is moving. And this is the great controversy which the Buddhists had with the Brahmanis. The Brahmanis said there is an eternal principle in man, which is unchangeable. And the Buddhists said, if it is unchangeable, it's dead. But if there is a changeable, a developing, growing, living mind, then you can't say that it is only a unit, an unchangeable unit. If it were unchangeable, then we could never attain nirvana. But if we are able to attain nirvana from our present state, it means that we can change. And this change is what we call the change of psyche. Psyche is, the Greek word psyche, which has been generally translated as soul, which is not a very good translation, means simply all our spiritual and inner faculties in their totality, with faculties which are able to grow, to develop, to change, and so on. So therefore we speak of psyche, and the Buddhists do not deny that everybody has a psyche which becomes the focal point of our experience. But this focal point should never be a fixed point, because, for instance, can you imagine your point of view as a child? You certainly are no more children. So I mean, just as you change from a child to a grown-up and so on, and yet you feel there is a connection, there is a kind of succession in it. You see, you don't become arbitrarily suddenly a grown-up from a child, but you slowly change from one state into another in a consequent fashion. That means it depends. Your present state depends on the states which we had developed from your childhood onwards. And this change is not an arbitrary change, but a change according to your inner law. So that this inner law we call character. That means the character of the child will not be very different from the grown-up, because it has evolved one from the other. So there is a connection in that sense. So if we speak of rebirth, there we have the conscious connection between different lives. It does not mean that we are now what we have been formerly. I hope not. In fact, I hope that there is an upward line in our development, and we should not expect to be in our afterlife, or whatever we may think about it. We should not expect to be the same as we are now. We hope to get over it, to overcome ourselves. So there we come to another expression, the idea of reincarnation. In both Buddhism and Hinduism, there is a difference. Hinduism speaks of transmigration, as you find in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. But Buddhism never speaks of transmigration, but of transformation, which is a different thing. Transmigration means that a certain unit, a fixed unit, wanders from one life to the other, or from one body to the other. The Buddhist conception is that you yourself create your own body in a future birth. That means you are not transmigrating, but you are transforming. You build the body according to your state of consciousness. If you have a highly developed consciousness, you will have a very highly developed body. If you have a lesser developed consciousness, you will have a lesser developed body. So the whole idea is that, for instance, the idea that any of the human beings would suddenly be reborn as a cow or a dog or a worm, which is, I think, rather unscientific thinking. I cannot prove it, but I think that if we see the laws of nature, then we find that nature never goes backwards. Nature always goes forwards. That means there is a certain law of evolution in the spiritual sense, in the bodily sense, and so on. Evolution can take many different shapes, but we never find the opposite direction. That means there may be a cyclic movement. For instance, if a tree has seeds and the seeds again become a tree, and so on, then we have a cyclic movement. That is understandable. That means they remain in the same cycle, but they won't go backwards. So therefore, we have to see that even the same term in Buddhism and in many of the Hindu religions does not mean the same thing, but means something very different. And so accordingly, we have to understand it. Yes?
Your comment that there is no principle in man that is unchangeable.
Yes. Yes.
It seemed to me that my understanding of it has been that somewhere at the root, poetically called the spark or other things, there is a point of that substance that seems to me what you call shunyati, and that it closed itself increasingly in complexity in order to have various experiences, and then we go back to this realization in some way. Is this inconsistent with the idea, or did I misunderstand something?
Well, I think that here we go into the realm of theories. Everything in the world that we know is under the law of change. There is nothing in the world that is not changeable. So therefore, any theory about something unchangeable would be only a theory. It is not confirmed by experience. So therefore, I would say your idea may be quite right, but we can't prove it.
In the experience of oneness.
Well, oneness.
Let him finish. Yeah, finish your question.
In that experience of oneness, since it is without a second, to realize the truth of that statement, and I thought this is what mystics were saying, it would seem to me that one would have to be that principle in some sense in order to finally get rid of all this change and make that realization. And because if there were anything realizing it, that would be a contradiction, because there would be that realized and the realizer. So if you didn't have this principle within you, how could you become one with it?
Well, first of all, since we do not believe in the unity without a second, that would be the Advaita idea, but which is not our idea. We do not believe in a principle that the one can be without a second. By the one means that the second is there. If there's one, it means second. It means there's a polarity. The whole world, you can observe everything in the world. There's nothing that is not based on polarity. You have always the two poles, positive and negative. You may have got male and female. You may have got the principles of materiality and non-materiality, and so on. Everything that you see in the world is based on polarity. And so therefore the idea that we could only, so to say, separate the good from the bad or so, or the oneness from the secondary thing or from the differentiation, that is a dream of philosophers, but that's not reality.
I thought of the oneness that dissolves the two, like when you put a positive and a negative charge of electricity together.
In that moment, they are eliminated.
Right.
You see, that the important thing is that the two poles must never meet, because if the two poles become one, then there is nothing. There's no more activity. There's no more any sensation. There's no more any consciousness. There's no more any. I mean, they wouldn't be conscious of the very fact. There can be a relationship. You can understand from the one pole. You can understand the other pole. But in the moment when the two poles eliminate each other, then it means nothing is there and nothing is being experienced. I would say that even when we speak of the experience of nirvana, that it means who experienced nirvana. There must be a duality, in a certain sense, not a duality, there must be a polarity between your experience and the experiencer. I mean, without that, there is no consciousness. Consciousness is based on that polarity.
This is not a getting out of consciousness and then a return and a rationalization of this thing. There's an actual experience situation as well.
Well, for instance, take samadhi. In samadhi, your life is not suspended. Samadhi is a state of unity in which the two poles, one can say, become conscious of each other, but do not completely clash, do not completely disappear. That means when you come out of samadhi, you are again a human being as any other person, and you have still the same differentiation of things. But samadhi is an important experience if you put it into so to say, into action in your own life. If you only sit in samadhi, nothing happens. And you are not better and not worse off than before. So most people think that samadhi is the ultimate point. But it is very interesting about in Buddhism, we speak of samadhi as one of the factors of enlightenment. But after samadhi, there comes again the step into the life. That means unless you can realize your samadhi in actual life, it is useless. It would be like only an intellectual understanding of something without any positive result.
You said, if I understood you correctly, that a superior consciousness will choose a superior body.
Did you understand correctly that a superior consciousness enters a superior body?
I would say a superior consciousness would form a superior body. That is true. Because it is the consciousness which builds up our body. You cannot separate your consciousness from your body. Even nowadays in physiology, we begin to understand that body and mind form a unit, and you can't just cure the body and leave out the mind, or cure the mind and leave out the body. Both are dependent on each other. And if there is a perfect mind, then it will form itself into a perfect body. And this may be also the reason, if you imagine that in former days, that it was said that the Buddha's body was so radiant, so wonderful, that even the golden cloth which was presented to him lost its luster. This is a beautiful simile. It means that an enlightened consciousness which was embodied in the Buddha was naturally embodied also in a perfect body. And so the old texts speak about the 32 principles of a Buddha's body. I mean, that may be a scholastic idea, but still the idea behind it is correct, because they wanted to express that the body in which the consciousness dwells must be in proportion to the mind, and therefore Buddha.
You explain how some very highly evolved souls will choose to be born into a very limited body, such as a Helen Keller or somebody like that, who obviously have advanced quite far along in their understanding of things, and yet choose to be born in an extremely limited body.
I didn't quite understand.
Will you repeat the question? Make it shorter, please.
How do you then explain why some very highly evolved souls, or people who certainly appear to be very highly evolved souls, will choose to incarnate in a very limited body, such as someone like Helen Keller, who would be born in a body that is deaf and blind, for example, or something like that?
First of all, even I would say that somebody who may be a very noble person may inhabit perhaps a very faulty body, because he is the effect of his general karma. That means his whole karma is not known to the person. He may have come now to the point where he is more evolved than before, but he has not yet erased the effects of his former deeds. And very often an imperfect body may be the result of deeds which we don't know, and which are now freeing the mind finally from those stains or from those effects. So we should not take it in a very narrow sense. We should always understand it as a general principle. Yes?
Do you think that the concept of deities has any value to us in the West?
Deities.
Concept of death.
Yes, I think your question is very, very correct. You see, the Western scholars have translated the Tibetan word Hla, as a deity or godness or whatever it is. And they have spoken of the deities of the gods of Northern Buddhism, for instance. You may know that book. Well, in reality, what has been represented as the gods of Northern Buddhism are the different forms of our consciousness. And the term Deva or Hla in Tibetan can mean any kind of state of consciousness in the world. And only our language has nothing to replace that word, and we speak of gods where actually we don't mean any outer entities, but something which is within our own mind. So we can say there are as many different minds as there are people in the world. So it means mind is a very complex thing, and the states of mind that are possible is infinite, and therefore you can represent it as an infinity of different deities or different forms of consciousness.
The middle race of demons were probably his projections from his own unconscious.
The concept of the demon is also connected with our consciousness. I would say that our consciousness can develop in a negative way, then we call it demon. If it develops in a positive way, we call it a deity. But anyway, they are both products of our consciousness, which may not always have been recognized as such. But that is really the deeper meaning, because if you follow the Buddhist iconography and how these different forms have appeared, then you will know that each deity goes back to a certain system of meditation which was created by one of the gurus. And according to the different teachers, different systems have developed. Now, instead of denying all the other systems, they are all recognized as such, but you can choose the one which you want to follow. So therefore, there's a great variety.
When you're given your yidam and your mantra, is the yidam regarded only then as a state of consciousness or as having a reality in
Yidam is, so to say, an Ishta Devata. Ishta Devata means the goddess or the god of your wish, of your desire. Take, for instance, in Catholic countries, you have the image of the Madonna, which is very beautiful. What actually we do, what it represents, is the essence of motherhood, the essence of love, the essence of gentility, of all that. And this is represented in the image of the Madonna. Now, in that sense, the Madonna is something which is very real in our own mind, because we have the qualities. So long as we have the qualities of love and devotion, so long we can say that there is also a Madonna. So it all boils down to faculties of our own mind or of our own spiritual make-up, and only in that form we can understand the diversity, because, as I say, diversity is a characteristic of life.
Is that true of Mahakala too?
Mahakala is
typical of Buddhism, or is there equivalent in Hinduism? Like Yamataka is in Vajrayana as well as in Tantric Hinduism.
Yes. Well, Mahakala, first of all, we have to understand what it means. Maha means great, and Kala means actually black, or it means the great time, because the word Kala means as well black as well as time. So therefore, Mahakala in Buddhism means the great time that appears to us as something black, something which seems to be almost negative, but which actually governs the whole world. Because even the gods are due to time. They have a birth, they have a life, and they disappear. You see all the many gods in the world. If you read the history of the world, you must be astonished how many gods already have disappeared.